My name is Eulalia Merrick, and I am 68 years old. My hands, weathered and marked by decades of labor, tremble as I write these words, not from age, but from the weight of what I must tell. This is the story of how I lost everything, and how I made certain that those who took from me would lose even more. It was the summer of 1838 in Virginia, on the Harrington plantation. The heat that year was merciless, pressing down on us like a physical weight as we worked the tobacco fields from dawn until we could no longer see our hands before our faces. I was 21 years old then, strong despite the scars that already marked my back, my spirit not yet broken by the brutality that surrounded me every day. I had given birth to my son, Samuel, 3 months earlier in the small cabin I shared with 5 other enslaved women. The birth had been difficult. I had labored through the night while the other women took turns holding my hands and singing softly to give me strength. When Samuel finally came into this world, his cry piercing the darkness, I felt something I had never known before, a love so fierce it terrified me. In that moment, holding his tiny, perfect body against my chest, I understood that I would do anything to protect him. But protection was not something we were allowed. We owned nothing, not even ourselves, and certainly not our children. Mrs. Catherine Harrington was 35 years old, beautiful in the way that cruelty can sometimes disguise itself as refinement. She had been trying for years to bear a child with her husband, Master Thomas, but each pregnancy ended in loss. I had seen the way grief twisted her face, had heard her sobbing through the walls of the big house where I worked as a housemaid when I wasn't needed in the fields. I should have felt sympathy for her pain, but I had learned long ago that sympathy was a luxury we could not afford. 3 weeks after Samuel's birth, I was called to the big house. It was early morning, the dew still heavy on the grass, and I had just finished feeding my son. He was sleeping peacefully in the wooden box that served as his cradle, his small fists curled against his chest. I kissed his forehead before I left, breathing in his sweet scent, never imagining it would be the last time I would hold him as mine. Mrs. Harrington was waiting for me in the parlor, her pale hands folded in her lap. Beside her stood Master Thomas, his expression unreadable. The overseer, Mr. Clemens, stood by the door, his presence always a threat, even when he was silent. "Eulalia," Mrs. Harrington said, her voice soft but firm, "I have made a decision that will benefit everyone involved. Your child will be raised in this house, under my care. He will be given advantages that you could never provide: education, proper food, shelter. He will want for nothing." The words hit me like physical blows. I stared at her, unable to comprehend what she was saying. "Ma'am?" My voice came out as barely a whisper. "The child will be taken this afternoon," Master Thomas said, his tone making it clear this was not a discussion. "You should be grateful. Many would see this as a blessing." A blessing. They called the theft of my child a blessing. "Please," I heard myself say, though I knew begging was useless. "Please, he needs his mother. He's just a baby. Please don't take him from me." Mrs. Harrington's expression hardened. "You will continue your duties as usual. The child will be well cared for. This conversation is over." I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face, words tumbling out in desperate pleas. I promised I would work harder, sleep less, do anything they asked. I begged them to reconsider, to show mercy, to remember their own humanity. But my words fell on ears that had been deaf to our suffering for generations. Mr. Clemens grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh, and dragged me from the room. I fought against him, screaming, calling out for anyone who might help, though I knew no help would come. He threw me out of the big house and I ran back to my cabin, my heart pounding with terror. But I was too late. 2 of the house servants, their faces filled with sorrow and helplessness, were already there. One of them held Samuel, wrapped in a fine blanket I had never seen before. My baby was crying, his small face red with distress, and the sound of his cries tore through me like a knife. "Give him to me," I screamed, reaching for him, but they stepped back. They had no choice. They were following orders, just as they always had to. "I'm sorry," one of them whispered, tears running down her own face. "I'm so sorry, Eulalia." And then they were gone, taking my son with them, and I collapsed on the dirt floor of the cabin, my body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of my soul. The other women gathered around me, holding me, crying with me, but nothing could ease the agony that consumed me. That night, as I lay in the darkness, my breasts aching with milk, my son would never drink, something shifted inside me. The grief was still there. It would never leave, but beneath it, something else began to grow. A cold, calculated rage, a determination that burned brighter than any pain. Mrs. Catherine Harrington had stolen my child. She had taken the only thing in this world that was truly mine. And in that moment, lying in the darkness, I made a vow that would shape the rest of my life. I would make her pay. I would destroy everything she held dear, just as she had destroyed me. I would be patient. I would be careful. And I would wait for the perfect moment to strike. I did not know then how long it would take, or what sacrifices I would have to make, but I knew, with absolute certainty, that justice would come. Not the justice of laws made by those who enslaved us, but a deeper justice, older and more terrible. They thought they had broken me. They thought I would accept their cruelty as I had accepted everything else. But they were wrong. In taking my son, they had awakened something in me that they could never control, never predict, and never escape. My name is Eulalia Merrick, and this is the story of how I ended the Harrington family's destiny. The days after they took Samuel blurred together in a haze of grief and forced routine. I was expected to continue my work as if nothing had happened, as if my arms did not ache with emptiness, as if every cry of a child did not pierce my heart anew. But I had made my vow, and to keep it, I had to survive. So I worked, I obeyed, and I watched. Samuel lived in the big house now, in a nursery that had been prepared with fine furniture and expensive fabrics. Mrs. Harrington kept him close, dressing him in clothes that cost more than my life was valued at, feeding him from silver spoons while we ate from wooden bowls. She called him Samuel Harrington, erasing even his name from me, though I had whispered it over him when he was born, had given him the name of my own father who I barely remembered. I was allowed to see him sometimes when Mrs. Harrington needed an extra pair of hands or when she wanted to parade her charitable act before her visitors. "Look how well we treat our people," she would say, gesturing to Samuel. "We've taken this child from poverty and given him every advantage." The visitors would nod approvingly, never seeing the truth, never acknowledging that she had torn a baby from his mother's arms. During those brief moments when I was near him, I would study Samuel's face, memorizing every feature, searching for recognition in his eyes. But as the months passed, he began to look at me the way he looked at any servant, with the casual indifference he was learning from those who raised him. He did not know me. He did not remember my heartbeat, the sound of my voice singing to him in those first precious weeks. To him, I was no one. That loss, the loss of his knowing, was almost worse than the initial theft. But I could not allow myself to dwell on it. I had work to do. I began to pay attention to everything in the big house. I learned the rhythms of the Harrington family, their habits and routines, their secrets and vulnerabilities. I listened to their conversations, standing silent and invisible in corners while they discussed business matters, family disputes, financial concerns. I observed the relationships between family members, noting the tensions, the resentments, the weaknesses. Master Thomas, I learned, was a heavy gambler. He traveled to Richmond regularly, ostensibly for business, but really to visit the gambling houses where he lost considerable sums. Mrs. Harrington did not know the full extent of his debts, though she suspected something was wrong when he sold off portions of land without consulting her. Mrs. Harrington herself had secrets too. She had a brother, Jonathan, who lived in Charleston and who wrote to her regularly. The letters came in plain envelopes, delivered by private courier rather than regular post. I managed to glimpse parts of one such letter when I was cleaning her writing desk. Jonathan was involved in some business venture that Master Thomas knew nothing about, something that required significant amounts of money that Mrs. Harrington was siphoning from the household accounts. Their marriage, I realized, was built on deception. They presented a united front to the world, but behind closed doors, they were slowly destroying each other through lies and betrayals. This knowledge was a weapon I carefully stored away. 3 years passed, then 5. Samuel grew from a baby into a young child, learning to read and write, being tutored in mathematics and history. Sometimes, when I was cleaning the schoolroom, I would look at his lessons and feel a bitter mixture of pride and anguish. My son was learning, was being educated in ways that were forbidden to me, but he was learning to be a master, learning the same cruelty and indifference that had allowed his existence to be stolen from me. During this time, I also learned to read and write. This was dangerous. Enslaved people caught with such knowledge faced severe punishment, but I was careful. An elderly man named Moses, who worked in the stables, had been taught by a previous owner who believed in religious instruction. Moses agreed to teach me, and we met in secret late at night, scratching letters in the dirt floor of the stable and erasing them before dawn. It took me 2 years to master the skill, but once I could read, a whole new world opened to me. I read the newspapers that were thrown away in the big house. I learned about the growing tensions between North and South, about the abolitionists who spoke against slavery, about the Underground Railroad that helped people escape to freedom. I read the letters in Master Thomas's desk when I had the chance, learning about his debts, his business failures, his desperate attempts to maintain appearances while his fortune crumbled. And I began to write. Not much at first, just a few words here and there, recording what I saw and heard. But gradually, I developed a plan. It was intricate and would require perfect timing, but if executed correctly, it would accomplish what I had vowed that terrible night 7 years ago. The opportunity came in 1845. I was 28 years old, and Samuel was 7. Master Thomas's gambling debts had finally caught up with him. He owed substantial sums to several men in Richmond, and they were demanding payment. He had already mortgaged portions of the plantation, but it was not enough. He needed more money, and he needed it quickly. I had been preparing for this moment, though I had not known exactly when it would arrive. Over the years, I had carefully gathered information, copies of letters, records of transactions, evidence of Mrs. Harrington's secret dealings with her brother. I had documented every lie, every deception, every financial irregularity, and I had found someone who might be willing to use this information. A lawyer in Richmond named Benjamin Foster. Mr. Foster was unusual for his time. He had represented enslaved people in freedom suits and had a reputation for taking on cases that other lawyers avoided. Getting information to him would be dangerous, but I had made contact through a network of people who moved between plantation and town. A letter, carefully written and containing enough evidence to pique his interest, was delivered by someone I trusted. Weeks passed with no response. I began to fear my plan had failed, that the letter had been intercepted or dismissed. But then, unexpectedly, Mr. Foster appeared at the plantation. He claimed to be there on business related to Master Thomas's debts, but he had another purpose as well. He was investigating irregularities in property transfers, and my letter had provided him with leads he could follow. I managed to speak with him briefly, in a moment when no one was watching closely. "The documents you need are in the master's desk, second drawer, behind the false panel," I whispered. "And Mrs. Harrington's correspondence with her brother is hidden in her bedroom, in a box beneath the floorboard, under the window." He looked at me with surprise and something like respect. "You're taking a tremendous risk," he said quietly. "I have already lost everything that matters," I replied. "What more can they take from me?" The storm I had been carefully constructing began to break 3 months after Mr. Foster's visit. It started subtly, a letter here, a legal inquiry there, but soon gained momentum that even I had not fully anticipated. The Harrington family, who had seemed so untouchable, began to crack under the pressure of their own secrets being exposed. The first blow came when Master Thomas's creditors learned about the true extent of his debts. Mr. Foster, working with other lawyers, had uncovered that Master Thomas had been fraudulently transferring property to avoid seizure. He had put land in Mrs. Harrington's name without properly recording the transactions, had sold parcels that were already mortgaged, and had borrowed money using assets he no longer owned. The legal complications were immense, and suddenly multiple parties were claiming rights to the Harrington property. I watched from my position of enforced invisibility as Master Thomas received summons after summons. His face, once ruddy with confidence and excess, became drawn and pale. He stopped eating properly, began drinking heavily, and spent hours locked in his study, trying desperately to untangle the web of lies he had created. Mrs. Harrington, for her part, was furious. Their arguments echoed through the big house, and I made certain to be nearby, listening, learning. "You've destroyed us!" Mrs. Harrington screamed one night. I stood in the hallway outside their bedroom, supposedly waiting to be called if needed, but really recording every word. "You're gambling. Your foolishness. You've put everything at risk." "Don't speak to me of foolishness," Master Thomas shot back. "What about the money you've been sending to your brother? Thousands of dollars for his failing business ventures, money taken from our accounts without my knowledge." That was when I learned that Mr. Foster had also exposed Mrs. Harrington's secret dealings. Her brother Jonathan's business in Charleston was in ruins, built on speculation and corruption. He had been using Mrs. Harrington's money to prop up his failing enterprises, and now those enterprises were being investigated for fraud. Mrs. Harrington's involvement, carefully documented in letters I had helped bring to light, made her complicit in her brother's schemes. The Harringtons were being attacked from multiple directions, their carefully maintained facade crumbling. But I was not finished. There was still more to be revealed. Samuel was now 7 years old enough to understand some of what was happening around him. I saw the confusion in his face as he watched the adults argue, as he noticed the tension that filled every room. Mrs. Harrington tried to shield him from the worst of it, but it was impossible. The collapse was too complete, too public. One afternoon, while I was working in the schoolroom, Samuel approached me. It was rare for him to speak to me directly. He had been taught to give orders to servants, not to converse with them. But something had shifted in him. "Why is everyone so angry?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. I looked at this child, my child, who did not know me. I wanted to tell him everything, who I was, what had been stolen, what I had done to seek justice. But he was too young, and the truth was too dangerous. "Sometimes people face consequences for the choices they make," I said carefully. "Even people who think they are above consequences." He studied my face, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes. A question, a wondering. But then Mrs. Harrington called for him, and he ran off, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The legal proceedings dragged on for months. The plantation was in chaos. Creditors began seizing property to satisfy debts. Some of the enslaved people were sold off, a horror I had not intended but could not prevent. I lived in constant fear that I would be among those sold, separated forever from Samuel, and unable to complete what I had started. But perhaps because I was considered valuable as a house servant, or perhaps because the situation was too complicated for such transactions, I remained. The final revelation came in the winter of 1846. Mr. Foster had discovered something even more damaging than the financial fraud. In going through old property records, he had found evidence that Master Thomas's claim to some of the land was illegitimate. His father had obtained portions of the plantation through forged documents 30 years earlier, stealing it from a neighboring family. This discovery invalidated not just Master Thomas's ownership, but potentially his father's entire estate. The scandal was enormous. The Harrington name, once respected throughout Virginia, became synonymous with corruption and deception. Master Thomas was arrested and held in Richmond to face trial. Mrs. Harrington, facing her own legal troubles related to her brother's schemes, was devastated. The big house, once filled with visitors and social gatherings, became silent and empty. I should have felt triumph. This was what I had worked toward for 8 long years, the destruction of the family that had destroyed me. And yet, watching it all unfold, I felt something more complex than simple satisfaction. I felt the weight of what I had done, the ripples of consequence that extended far beyond the Harringtons themselves. But I also felt the righteousness of it. They had taken my child. They had treated human beings as property, had built their wealth and comfort on the suffering of others. If their world was collapsing, it was a world that deserved to collapse. One evening, as I was preparing the schoolroom for what I suspected would be the last time, I found Mrs. Harrington sitting alone in the dark. Samuel was asleep upstairs, and the house was quiet. She looked up when I entered, and for the first time, I saw her without her mask of superiority. She looked old, defeated, broken. "You," she said suddenly, her voice hoarse. "You're the one." I don't know how, but somehow you did this." I met her gaze steadily. No longer the cowering servant, no longer willing to pretend. "You took my son," I said quietly. "Did you think there would be no consequence? Did you think I would simply accept it?" She stared at me, and I saw recognition dawning in her eyes, not just of what I had done, but of the humanity she had always denied me. "He's my son now," she whispered, but the words lacked conviction. "He will never be your son," I replied. "You can dress him in fine clothes, teach him to read, give him everything I could not, but he was born of my body, carried beneath my heart. That truth doesn't change, no matter how hard you try to erase it." Mrs. Harrington turned away, her shoulders shaking. I left her there in the darkness and walked out of the big house into the cold night air. The stars were brilliant overhead, and I breathed deeply, feeling something I had not felt in 8 years, a sense of completion, of justice served, if not yet fully achieved. The winter of 1847 brought the final collapse of the Harrington dynasty. Master Thomas was convicted of fraud and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Mrs. Harrington's brother Jonathan fled Charleston ahead of his own legal troubles, disappearing somewhere in the Caribbean. The plantation was sold at auction to satisfy the debts and legal claims against it. I stood with the other enslaved people as we watched strangers walk through our quarters, assessing our value like we were livestock. The fear among us was palpable. We did not know who would buy us, whether families would be kept together or torn apart, whether our new situations would be better or worse. This was the terrible reality of our existence. Our lives could be completely upended by the financial failures of those who claimed to own us. The plantation was purchased by a man named Robert Cheswick, a merchant from Baltimore who had made his fortune in shipping. He was younger than Master Thomas, perhaps in his early 40s, and he approached the property as a business investment rather than a family estate. This meant he evaluated everything through the lens of efficiency and profit, which had both advantages and dangers for those of us who lived and worked there. Mrs. Harrington and Samuel were allowed to remain in a small cottage on the property, a concession made because she literally had nowhere else to go. Her family had disowned her due to the scandal, and her husband's imprisonment left her without means or support. She was permitted to stay in exchange for managing some of the household duties, a humiliating reversal of her former status. The mistress had become, in many ways, a servant herself. Samuel was now 9 years old enough to understand that everything had changed. He had gone from being the cherished son of a wealthy plantation family to living in a cottage with a disgraced woman, his future uncertain. I saw the confusion and fear in his face, and despite everything, my heart ached for him. He was innocent in all of this, a child who had been caught in a web of adult cruelty and revenge. Under Mr. Cheswick's ownership, some things changed. He did not believe in the excessive brutality that had characterized Master Thomas's oversight. The whippings decreased, the working conditions improved marginally, and he allowed enslaved families to remain together when possible. These were small mercies in a fundamentally evil system, but after years under the Harringtons, even small improvements felt significant. Mr. Cheswick was also unusual in another way. He believed slavery was economically unsustainable and morally questionable. He never said this publicly. Such opinions were dangerous in Virginia in 1847, but I overheard him discussing it with his business partner during a visit. "The system is dying," he said. "The costs of maintaining it, the political tensions it creates, it cannot last much longer. We must prepare for a different future." I found this fascinating. Here was a man who participated in slavery, who owned human beings, yet who acknowledged its wrongness and anticipated its end. The contradiction was striking, but perhaps it also represented an opportunity. I had been careful since the auction, keeping my head down, appearing to be nothing more than a compliant servant, but I had not abandoned my goals. Samuel was still here, still within reach, and I still hoped that somehow, some way, I might build a relationship with him, might help him understand the truth of his origins. One spring morning, I was working in the garden near the cottage where Mrs. Harrington and Samuel lived. Samuel came out to play, and for once, no adult was watching closely. He wandered over to where I was working, drawn by curiosity or perhaps by something deeper that he did not fully understand. "What are you planting?" he asked. Vegetables, mostly, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. Beans, tomatoes, squash. He watched me work for a while, then asked, "Do you like working in the garden?" It was such a simple question, but it was perhaps the first time in his life he had asked me anything about my preferences, my feelings. "Yes," I said honestly. "When I work with the soil, help things grow, I feel connected to something larger than myself. It reminds me that even in difficult circumstances, life finds a way to continue." He seemed to consider this. "Everything is different now," he said quietly. "Mother, Mrs. Harrington, says we have to be grateful for what we have, but I don't understand how we went from having everything to having almost nothing." I paused in my work and looked at him directly. Sometimes the things people build are not as solid as they appear. When they're built on lies, on the suffering of others, they cannot stand forever. He frowned, trying to understand. Did my father, did Master Thomas, build on lies? "That is something you will have to judge for yourself when you are older," I said carefully. "But I will tell you this. The world is more complicated than you have been taught. People are more complicated. And the line between right and wrong is sometimes clearer than those in power want us to believe." We talked for a while longer, nothing deep or revelatory, but it was a connection. Over the following months, these conversations became more frequent. I was careful never to push, never to reveal too much, but slowly I began to plant seeds of another kind, questions that might one day grow into understanding. Meanwhile, the wider world was changing. The tensions between North and South over slavery were intensifying. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, requiring that escaped enslaved people be returned to their owners, even if they had reached free states. This inflamed abolitionists and made the Underground Railroad even more active and more necessary. I heard stories of people escaping, finding freedom, starting new lives. These stories gave me hope, even as they highlighted the risks and difficulties of such attempts. Mr. Cheswick traveled frequently for business, and when he returned, he often brought newspapers from different cities. I managed to read these whenever possible, keeping myself informed about the changing political landscape. By 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act had created violent conflicts over whether new territories would allow slavery. The country was tearing itself apart over the question of human bondage, and I wondered if I would live to see the resolution. Samuel was now 16 years old, on the cusp of manhood. Our conversations had continued over the years, and I had watched him grow from a confused child into a thoughtful young man. He had been educated enough to read and think critically, and he had begun to question the world around him. I could see him struggling with the contradictions he observed. The kindness of individual enslaved people contrasted with the cruelty of the system, the declarations of Christian morality alongside the brutality of human ownership. One afternoon, he asked me directly, "Why don't you hate me?" The question took me by surprise. We were alone in the garden, as we often were during these conversations. "What makes you think I should hate you?" I asked. "Because of what happened to you. What Mrs. Harrington did, taking your child." He looked at me with eyes that finally understood. "I know what happened. I found letters, documents. I know that Mrs. Harrington took a baby from an enslaved woman and raised him as her own. I know that baby was me." My heart was pounding. This was the moment I had both longed for and feared. "When did you learn this?" "I've suspected for years," he said quietly. "The way you looked at me sometimes, the things you said. But I found definitive proof a few months ago. Letters between Mrs. Harrington and her sister, discussing it all." He paused. "You're my mother, aren't you?" I could have denied it. It might have been safer to deny it. But I was tired of lies, tired of hiding. "Yes," I said simply. "I am your mother. You were 3 months old when she took you from me." Samuel stood frozen, his face cycling through shock, confusion, and something that looked like grief. The garden around us was bursting with late summer growth, but the air between us felt heavy with 17 years of unspoken truth. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally asked, his voice breaking. "What could I have said?" I replied, my own voice thick with emotion. "When you were a child, you would not have understood, and it would have put both of us in danger. As you grew older, you had been taught to see me as property, as less than human. How could I bridge that divide? How could I make you understand what had been stolen from both of us? He sank down onto the ground, his head in his hands. I don't know who I am, he whispered. Everything I thought I knew about myself is a lie. I sat beside him, careful to maintain some distance. The old habits of enforced separation were hard to break. You are Samuel, I said gently. You are intelligent and thoughtful. You question injustice, even when it makes you uncomfortable. You are kind to those who have no power. These things are true regardless of how you came to be raised as you were. But I'm not white, he said, and I heard the anguish in his voice. I thought I was white. Mrs. Harrington raised me to believe. He stopped, unable to continue. This was the painful reality we had to confront. Samuel's skin was light. I am light-skinned myself, and his father had been white. But if one knew what to look for, the markers of his heritage were there. Mrs. Harrington had been able to maintain the fiction because she had taken him so young, because she controlled the narrative, because people saw what they expected to see. You are my son, I said firmly. You have the blood of Africa in your veins, the blood of people who survived horrors you cannot imagine. You also have the blood of those who inflicted those horrors. You contain both histories within you, and you must decide what kind of man you will be. We sat in silence for a long time. Birds sang in the trees, and the sun moved across the sky, and slowly Samuel began to ask questions. He wanted to know everything, about the day he was born, about his father, one of Master Thomas's cousins who had forced himself on me during a visit to the plantation, about those first 3 months when I had been his mother in every way that mattered. I told him everything I could remember. I described how he had felt in my arms, how he had smelled, the sounds he made, the way his tiny fingers would grip mine. I told him about the night they took him, about my grief and rage, about the vow I had made. And yes, I told him about what I had done to bring down the Harrington family. You destroyed them, he said, and I could not tell if it was accusation or acknowledgement. I sought justice, I replied. They destroyed themselves through their own greed and corruption. I simply helped reveal what was already there. And what about me, he asked. Did you think about what this would mean for me? Growing up in the ruins of their downfall? The question cut deep because it was fair. I did think about it, I said honestly. But I also thought about the thousands of other children torn from their mother's arms. I thought about the women who will never see their babies again, who don't even know if they're alive or dead. What happened to you was terrible, but at least you are alive. At least you have been educated. At least you have the chance to choose who you will become. He absorbed this, his young face struggling with concepts that should never have been his burden to bear. What happens now? He asked finally. That depends on many things beyond our control, I said. But I hope that we can know each other, truly know each other, for whatever time we have. Over the following months, Samuel and I developed a real relationship. We could not be openly mother and son. That would have been too dangerous for both of us, but we found ways to spend time together, to talk, to build something new from the ruins of what had been stolen. Samuel began to change in visible ways. He started questioning Mrs. Harrington about her choices, confronting her with the truth of what she had done. Their relationship, already strained by years of reduced circumstances, became even more difficult. She tried to defend herself, to justify her actions, but even she could not truly believe her own justifications anymore. I gave you a better life, she told him during one argument that I overheard. I saved you from slavery. You enslaved my mother, Samuel shot back. You stole me from her and pretended it was charity. There is no justification for that. The political situation continued to deteriorate. In 1857, the Dred Scott decision declared that black people, whether enslaved or free, could not be American citizens and had no rights that white people were bound to respect. The ruling shocked even those who had hoped for gradual reform. The lines were being drawn for a conflict that seemed increasingly inevitable. Mr. Cheswick, seeing which way the wind was blowing, began to make preparations. He quietly made arrangements for some of the enslaved people on his property to be released or to escape north. He did not do this out of pure altruism. He was protecting his business interests, anticipating a future where slavery would no longer exist, and he would need to maintain relationships with workers rather than own them. But regardless of his motivations, his actions created possibilities. In late 1858, he approached me with an unexpected proposal. "I am traveling to Philadelphia on business," he said. "I need someone to accompany me to manage household matters during the trip. You would be gone for several weeks." I understood immediately what he was offering. Philadelphia was in the north, in a free state. If I chose not to return, there would be little he could do about it. He was giving me an opportunity to escape. "Why?" I asked directly. He looked uncomfortable, a man wrestling with his own contradictions. "Because this is wrong," he said simply. "I have always known it was wrong, and I have profited from it anyway. I cannot undo the past, but I can make different choices going forward." I thought about his offer carefully. Freedom was what I had longed for my entire life. The chance to live as a human being with rights, with agency, with control over my own destiny. It was almost incomprehensible. But there was Samuel. If I left, I would be abandoning him again, just as we had finally found each other. "Can my son come with me?" I asked. Mr. Chesak shook his head. "Samuel is legally considered white. He is free to leave whenever he chooses, but that choice must be his own. I cannot make it for him." I spoke with Samuel that night, telling him about the opportunity. "You should go," he said immediately. "You should be free. Come with me," I urged. "You can have a life in the north, a real life, free from all of this." But he hesitated. "I need more time," he said. "I need to understand who I am before I can decide where I should be. And there are others here, people who have been kind to me, who I can help. If there is truly going to be a war over slavery, I need to decide what role I will play." I understood, though it pained me. He was 19 years old, standing at the crossroads of identity and destiny, trying to find his place in a world that had lied to him about everything. He needed to make his own choices, even if those choices meant we would be separated again. "I will go," I told Mr. Cheswick, "and I will not return." I left Virginia in November 1858, traveling north with Mr. Cheswick as his servant, with papers that identified me as his property. But when we reached Philadelphia, I simply walked away. Mr. Cheswick made no effort to stop me. He had kept his word, had given me the gift of freedom that should have been my birthright. Those first months in Philadelphia were disorienting. I had to learn how to live as a free person, to make decisions about my own life, to navigate a world that was still hostile to Black people, but where at least the basic fact of my humanity was legally recognized. I found work as a seamstress, rented a small room, and began to build a life. I also became involved in the abolitionist movement. I met people who had dedicated their lives to ending slavery, both Black and white activists who risked everything to help enslaved people escape and to advocate for immediate emancipation. I told my story at meetings, described what I had experienced and witnessed, added my voice to the chorus demanding justice. Through the abolitionist networks, I was able to maintain some contact with Samuel. Letters came periodically, careful in their wording in case they were intercepted, but conveying enough that I knew he was safe and wrestling with his identity and purpose. In 1859, he wrote to tell me about John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, an attempt to start an armed slave revolt. The raid failed, and Brown was executed, but the incident intensified the national crisis. "Everything is coming to a head," Samuel wrote. "People speak openly of disunion, of war. I believe it will happen, perhaps within the next few years. When it does, I will have to choose a side. You should know that I have decided. I cannot remain neutral in a conflict over whether people who look like my mother should be free." In 1861, the war came. South Carolina seceded from the Union after Abraham Lincoln's election, followed by other southern states. In April, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, and the nation split apart. The Civil War had begun. Samuel enlisted in the Union Army in 1862, after Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. He could have stayed safe. His appearance and background would have allowed him to avoid the conflict, but he chose to fight. He wrote to me before he left, "I am fighting for you, for the family I never knew, for all those who are still in bondage. This is how I can begin to make amends for the advantages I was given through stolen identity." The war years were agonizing. I worked in Philadelphia, supporting the war effort, helping formerly enslaved people who fled north, and living in constant fear for Samuel's safety. News of battles came regularly, long lists of casualties that I scanned with my heart in my throat, terrified I would see his name. He survived Antietam, Gettysburg, the Wilderness Campaign. He was wounded twice but recovered both times. Through his letters, I watched him mature from an uncertain young man into someone who had found purpose and clarity in the fight for justice. The war ended in April 1865 with General Lee's surrender at Appomattox. The Confederacy was defeated. Slavery was abolished. The long nightmare was finally over. Samuel came to Philadelphia that summer. I saw him walking up the street toward my boarding house, still in his Union uniform, and I ran to him. We embraced openly for the first time in our lives, mother and son, with no need to hide or pretend. We both wept for all that had been lost and all that had finally been won. We talked for days, sharing our experiences of the war years, trying to process the enormity of what had happened. The nation had been transformed. 4 million people were now free. The future was uncertain, but filled with possibility. "What will you do now?" I asked him. "I want to go south," he said, "to help with reconstruction. There are schools being established for formerly enslaved people, legal aid organizations, efforts to help people claim their rights as citizens. My education, my experience, I can use these things to help." I felt pride surge through me. This young man, who had been stolen from me and raised to be a master, had chosen instead to dedicate himself to justice. "Your father would be proud," I said, though I had never truly known my own father. "I am proud." Samuel did go south, working for the Freedmen's Bureau and later establishing a school for black children in Virginia, not far from where we had both lived in bondage. He married a woman named Clara, a formerly enslaved person who worked as a teacher. They had 3 children, my grandchildren, who grew up free and educated. As for Mrs. Catherine Harrington, she died in 1867, broken and alone. Master Thomas had died in prison years earlier. The Harrington name disappeared from prominence, remembered only as a cautionary tale about corruption and downfall. I lived to see Reconstruction, to see black men vote and hold office, to see families reunited and schools established and churches built. I also lived to see the violent backlash, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the gradual erosion of the gains that had been made. The fight for true equality was far from over. But I also saw my son become a man of principle and purpose. I saw my grandchildren learn to read and write. I saw people I had known in slavery make new lives in freedom. These victories were real, even if incomplete. Now, at 68 years old, I am writing this account. Samuel encouraged me to record my story, to preserve it for future generations who need to understand what was endured and what was overcome. This is not a story of perfect heroism or simple victory. It is a story of survival, of resistance, of using whatever tools were available to fight against injustice. I do not regret bringing down the Harrington family. They built their comfort on the bodies of enslaved people, and they tore my child from my arms without remorse. The consequences they faced were consequences of their own actions. I simply helped reveal the truth that they had tried to hide. What I learned through all of this is that the powerful are never as invincible as they appear. Systems of oppression seem permanent until they suddenly crumble, and individuals, even those who seem powerless, have more agency than they are led to believe. It requires courage, patience, intelligence, and often sacrifice. But change is possible. My son and I lost 17 years we should have had together. Those years can never be recovered. But we found each other again, and we both lived to see freedom. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. To those who read this account in the future, remember that the freedoms you enjoy were paid for with the suffering and resistance of those who came before. Honor that sacrifice by continuing the work of justice. The struggle is never truly finished. Every generation must decide what kind of world it will create, what kind of people it will be. I am Eulalia Merrick. I was born into slavery, but I did not die enslaved. I fought back in the only ways I could, and I lived to see my son choose the path of justice. That is my legacy. That is my victory. And perhaps most importantly, Never forget that every person labeled as property, every human being bought and sold, was someone's mother, someone's child, someone's beloved. We were never the things they claimed we were. We were always fully human, deserving of dignity, respect, and freedom. That truth could not be destroyed, no matter how hard they tried. This is my story. This is my testimony. May it serve as a reminder of what was endured, what was resisted, and what was ultimately overcome. The end. This narrative is a work of historical fiction designed to illuminate the realities of slavery, resistance, and the long struggle for justice. While the specific characters are fictional, their experiences reflect the lived realities of millions of enslaved people in America between 1619 and 1865, and the generations that followed who continued fighting for true freedom and equality.